Yeah, it's muted. Here we go.
Thank you so much. I don't think I have ever read anything so fast in my life. I have just tried to read all of your responses, and I see some more are still coming, so I'll read them when I get to do a little pause. And so interesting to read about all your projects. There's several projects here where I'm thinking, oh, please tell me more, but I guess it's my turn to speak, not your turn. But thank you so much for coming today, and thank you so much for sharing so much about you in the chats now. And hopefully, I don't know if you've realized, but it's actually possible for you to send private messages to each other. And I certainly see some overlaps and links here between people's different projects. So I wonder if you see anyone there that's doing something that you might want to know more about, it is possible to send them a direct message on the chat, I think by clicking on their name. So if you get bored of listening to me, it might be something that you can do. Now, let me just check with Demet that you can hear me and everything's fine. Very good. Okay, so well, first I want to say, obviously, thanks to the organisers for organising all this. Thank you to my wonderful chairs for all their help today and in our preparation meetings. Before you all came, we had a chance to show each other our slippers and our pyjamas that you can't see in the cameras. So it is quite an interesting experience for the three of us to be in this kind of public mode, while at the same time be in our slippers and our pyjamas where you don't see them. So I guess this is new for everyone. And I have to say, it's so lovely to be able to do this conference anyway. And as I say, thank you so much to the organisers for making this possible. Thanks to Carly and everyone else. I know it was a lot of hard work. And I'm very, very happy that this has been possible. But the problem is we miss out on what for me is one of, I think, the favourite aspect of feminist conferences, and certainly AtGender conferences, which is seeing people in the coffee breaks and saying hello. I've been seeing everyone's names, and I see the names and the images of lots of people I know, colleagues at Warwick, hello everyone, but also colleagues in other countries, so many countries are represented here. And so a hello to everyone, whatever your time zone, but a special hello to the friends that I've made over the years in AtGender conferences. I wish I could give you a proper hug this time round, but we'll have to wait for the next conference. Okay, so on this point about so many countries being represented, a large proportion of us is not native English speaking. I'm not a native English speaker myself, but I do have a tendency to speak quite fast. And I know when you're not a native English speaker, people speaking very quickly, people using acronyms or making references to things you don't understand can be an issue. So if at any point you want me to slow down or you want me to explain an acronym that I've used, just give me a note on the group chat. I can see it here, and I'll try to explain and slow down. So let's get cracking. Now, I was invited by the organisers to give this workshop, and I was very happy to be invited. But then when the COVID-19 situation evolved, I was thinking, does anyone have the headspace right now to be thinking about publication? You know, it was definitely the last thing on my mind. I've got 2 kids in the house now, and, you know, been quite anxious about the whole situation. So really, publication is the last thing that I'm thinking about, and that's what I should be doing actually this month, but I'm not managing to do it at all. And it's not just the issue of time, it's the issue of headspace. I think writing requires a certain peace of mind that I think is very hard to have at this moment in time. So much of this may feel a bit weird to be talking about right now, but I hope it's somehow still useful. And I want to start by introducing myself and telling you a little bit about my publication experience, and not to show off or to kind of give you my CV, but because this is a very, very important point in what I want to say to you today. Every single thing that I say, even when I say it with a lot of certainty, is very specific. It's very contingent. It will vary from journal to journal. So I might give you advice that would be perfectly suited to the journals that I've published in, but it might not be suited to the journals that you're interested in. So the reason I'll tell you a little bit about my experience is so you can see what kind of journals the advice I'm going to give you might apply to, and know that that might not be the case everywhere. So I'm currently an editor, one of the editors for the journal Feminist Theory. It's an international journal based in the UK at the moment. And my publications have been in only in Portuguese journals, in UK journals, in US journals, and in Swedish journals. And again, this is important because different countries will have very different publication landscapes. The journals I've published in have been in feminist scholarship, women's studies, gender studies, in sociology, in science and technology studies, and also some general social science ones. But they've not been in other kinds of disciplines that you've mentioned, like politics and others, where there might be different disciplinary expectations and where things might be a bit more positivist, say, than some of the things I'm going to tell you, that are definitely more applicable to more critical journals, more reflexive journals, and certainly more qualitative social science type journals. I've published in graduate journals, and I think those are a really, really important thing to look at and support. So journals run by PhD students and early career scholars and aimed at them. And I love them because they're often much more careful about giving you constructive advice in peer review and helping you develop your skills. And I've published in national journals and international journals, and those two can be very different as well in terms of the framing of the article, as I'll discuss in a second. And so yes, so today I'm mostly going to focus on critical, qualitative feminist journals. They're all different, but there's some things that they might share, but what I say might not apply to a mainstream journal in your field, and I'll leave it to you to work out with your colleagues and mentors, with your own judgment, which of these bits of advice are helpful and which are not. Also, obviously, the publishing landscape is different because we're under different forms of pressure in different countries to publish. Some of you in the chat mentioned the REF, the Research Excellence Framework, an exercise in the UK where where institutions are ranked, evaluated, funded on the basis of publication productivity. Obviously, that means publication in the UK has a certain temporality, a certain criteria of what counts as a valuable publication, and that will be different in other countries. So again, bear that in mind as you hear people's questions and as you hear my presentation. So what I'm going to do now is show you, if I can work this out, just give me 1 second, so I can show you some slides that I have for today. So I'm going to be alternating between slides and turning off the slide so you can see me. Now, what I can see at the moment is that, is it right that most of you can see the slides, but in the corner, I can see Demet in the corner, but I think you can click in the corner to be able to see more people and to see me, so that you can see my face as I talk about the slides, although Demet's face is always inspiring as well. So, so let me take you through what I've got planned for today. I like to be very interactive when I speak and sort of bring people in, but with 100 of you and limited time, and with many of you clearly wanting tips and advice, I'm going to just be very boring and just speak to you for quite a long time, dump lots of information on you, and then we can stop for questions and answers. So apologies for the not very interactive, not very feminist way of presenting. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to be talking about is, just very briefly, is why publishing. And I'll say this more to get you into a certain kind of headspace. I then want to tell you very briefly about the structure of contemporary commercial academic publishing, because I'm not going to give you a lesson on its structure, but it will help you, again, get into the right mindset to make sense of some of the tips I'm going to give you. Then I will move on to those tips, and that will be divided into 4 rough sections: framing the article, writing the article, submitting the article, and revising the article. I'll talk a little bit about publishing in a pandemic. I know some of you, hi Rika, have come on purpose to listen to that, but that will be fairly brief. Apologies in advance. And then there'll be some time for questions and answers. So, why would we want to publish? Obviously, most of us get in a stress about publishing because we're told that we will publish or we will perish as academics. So for many of us, there's a sort of career building element that can be quite tense and quite stressful. And I could see many of you in the group chat mentioning things like the ref, your CV, needing to get certain kinds of publications to be accepted. And so many people are worried about this, that there's all sorts of cartoons on this on the internet about this idea of publishing or perishing. Now, it's not a coincidence that all of these have men and men's names, and we know already that in the current pandemic, men have increased their rate of publication. Men are submitting to journals more than ever, and women are submitting to journals less, with really low numbers. And obviously feminist journals are disproportionately affected. And all the journals, all the papers I've had since the pandemic started as an editor to look at have all been by men, so in a feminist journal. So clearly this is happening and affecting us, but we can talk about that later on briefly. But we don't want to publish just so to avoid perishing. And I think this is important to remember, because I think sometimes in the stress of ticking the boxes of what you have to do publication-wise, you kind of miss out on the joy of publishing, and it's very easy for the joy to disappear, because it can be a very stressful process, especially when you start to get peer review reports and you have to revise them. Demet is smiling, she's just been through that herself. I'm sure she won't mind me sharing this, and it can be quite soul destroying. So it's good to think about the more constructive reasons why we publish. And for me, one of the main ones is that it's a learning process. And I don't want to say this in a kind of cliche way, oh, you know, it's good to learn, but the conversations with peer reviewers can be really profound learning processes, because their opinions about your articles say as much about them as they do about you, probably more about them than they do about you. So if you think about it, not as you failing or you being judged, but as a process of learning more about how people read others' texts, how they interpret it, where they're coming from when they engage with your work. You can learn a lot about the nature of knowledge production, how to share knowledge, how to understand different people's epistemological positions, methodological positions. So try, when you get depressed, to think about this as a dialogue, as a way of communicating your research, as a form of understanding knowledge and critiquing knowledge, and also obviously making your own contributions in academic debates. And unfortunately, all of this is happening in a terrible context of profit-orientated, cartel-structured commercial academic publishing. I mean, now that I'm an editor in a journal and I see the inside of it, it's really quite terrifying how, you know, capitalist and neoliberal it all is. And some of you mentioned in the group chat that you wanted to learn more about how to do publication in a more feminist, sustainable way. That's a really interesting conversation to have, not one I have a lot of time to get into now, but it is a conversation that we have to have, because, you know, a lot of feminist journals have tried to get into these indexing platforms, these big publishers, to become more accepted, more valuable, but that comes at a very heavy cost in terms of how these journals have to be managed. And just a little bit on this to give you a bit of context. The way that these things work is we do the labor of writing, we do the labor of reviewing, we do the labor of editing, but then we have to pay to read these journals. There's a lot of money that is involved here, and this is a profit-making business. So what that means is that we will be asked in many countries to look at the impact factor, for example, of journals, and I'm just going to very quickly take you through that. If you just bear with me while I get another screen up to show you. what I wanted to show you. Okay, share screen, and I'm going to show you this one. So this is the ranking at this moment in for I think 2018 of journals in the field of women's studies, as the Journal Citation Reports categorizes it. I won't go into this in a lot of detail, just to say the journals that are here are a very specific, narrow group of journals, and this ranking doesn't really say very much about what value they have to people. It tells us something about the value that they have in terms of metrics, but that doesn't mean that, say, Psychology of Women Quarterly is seen by people to be better than Gender Work and Organization, for example. They're very different journals, different disciplines, different audiences. And so really, I would say, do not just go by these rankings when you make decisions. A lot of these, much of this impact factor is about how often a journal is published, how citation works in that particular discipline. But as you can see, straight away, we notice all sorts of things. Anglo journals being dominant, journals from particular regions of the world and particular countries being dominant. So take this with a pinch of salt. But definitely what I would say, and let me just get back to my slide so you can see that, is, well, where are we? Okay, can you, no, you're still seeing the website, aren't you?
Yes.
Okay. So these impact factors are only calculated for index journals and for citations in those journals. So sometimes we find ourselves in the journals I've been involved in doing silly things, you know, like telling our authors in one year to please cite articles in our journal from the previous year because that helps our metrics. So often when people say to you, make sure you cite articles from that journal, it's so that you show that you know the journal, so that you know the debates, but also because it helps everyone's metrics. And this is, I find, very sad, but the way that things work. And obviously not all journals are included. The business that runs this, Clarivet Analytics, you know, how are they making decisions? But I won't go into that now. What I do want to go into is how these features of commercial academic publishing might affect your own experiences of publishing. So I'll just tell you a few things to bear in mind. When we publish a journal in one of an article in one of these journals, we tend to apply to that experience the kind of principles and ideas that we have about, say, writing a PhD thesis or writing a book. So many of us, when we're PhD students, we want to show that we've read a lot of things. Or maybe we're worried about the politics of citation and we want to cite a whole range of people to show that we're engaging with scholars writing from a range of backgrounds. So a lot of us get in the habit of filling an article with references as a way of demonstrating our knowledge, but also as a political intervention. Now, for these journals, space is money, right? Because the more articles that can be fit in an issue, the more citations you might get, therefore the higher metrics. So each page costs money. So they do not want to waste pages, i.e. money, on references, right? So they don't want you to have lots of references. And this creates really big problems as you're trying to show other people's work, amplify their work, show your knowledge, but also be very economical with your references. So that's one thing that is a big shift when we're writing stuff where space isn't money and where you're writing for a journal like this. Also, often journals don't want you to waste, and I use scare quotes here, waste space and money on things like long literature reviews or very detailed methodological sections. Some journals will want those, but most journals, they assume that if you're sending an article to them, even if you're a PhD student, an MA student, you know what you're talking about. So in a PhD thesis and an MA dissertation, you have to prove that you've read things, that you know what you're talking about. Someone's evaluating you on your knowledge. But here, people are among colleagues, supposedly, so no one wants too much time wasted on the basics. And in fact, it will signal you as someone who is not experienced if you're wasting too much time on the basics and too much money for the journal. I've also mentioned citing other articles in the journal. That helps with the metrics. Using buzzwords in the title. I hate this one, but again, it helps with discoverability on Google. So often people try to write very detailed, very precise titles, but actually buzzword titles. Buzzword means words that people, that are fashionable or that are popular and that people are likely to go and search for online. Other things to bear in mind, let me have a look. I'll come back to this in a second, but don't cover everything in your article. Someone mentioned, I think it was someone called Sophia, talked about wanting tips on strategic publishing. And I'm going to talk a lot about that, how to be strategic and how much you give of your research in each publication. But I'll come back to that in a second. But the reason why you don't want to cover too much is that you want to think about each article as then citing your other work and linking people to your other work in a way that also unfortunately helps your metrics, your own metrics, if you're in a context where that's important. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through those 4 aspects of publishing and give you practical tips on all of them. I will mostly be discussing articles, but for many of you who haven't published before, I really recommend writing book reviews as an experience. I'm thinking of you, Liz, and others who I know have been writing really excellent book reviews as a way of not so much just familiarizing yourself with the writing, but also familiarizing yourself with that process of sending something on Manuscript Central or email or whatever platform the journal uses and getting something back. You know, it can be a bit scary. So a book review is a really good way of doing that. And a book review, as many of you know, is a short piece on a book or a set of books. Not all journals have them, so do check. And if you're interested in writing book reviews, we love it in a journal if you contact us and say, hi, I'm a PhD student, I love your journal, I'd love to write book reviews for you, because often we have books lying around and we don't know who else to ask for book reviews. So feel free to contact journals directly using the details. Often the website will tell you who the book review editor is, but if that information isn't there and they do publish book reviews, you can contact whatever general email address they have and say that you're available. Some of the stuff I will say about strategic publishing, about tips on making your writing more engaging, will also apply to books and to book proposals. So hopefully that will be useful for those of you in the group chat who mentioned that. So I'm just going to breathe now. As you can see, I speak too fast, get out of breath. If anyone thinks I'm speaking too fast or wants me to explain something I've said that wasn't clear, you can write it in the chat now. And also as I speak, if questions come up, write them straight away, because then Demet and Charlène can manage those questions in the question and answer session at the end, so that you're not all writing them at the same time. Okay, so practical links. Before doing that, I was just going to have a quick look at all your faces, but the problem is if I look at your faces on my screen, then they appear in the recording, and I'm not supposed to let you do that. So I'm on my phone now, just swiping through hundreds of people. Hi, Liz, and all sorts of people that I know. I won't start doing shout outs to everyone, that would be very sad. Okay, let me share with you, go back to the presentation. Okay, so let's get on those tips. So what I'm going to do in these tips, and this is a special present for someone listening today, is I'm going to use a metaphor. As you can see, I'm going to talk about framing the article, and I'm going to be using the metaphor of a framed work of art in a museum. to help us understand some of the things around framing the article. That's the section I'm going to spend more time on, because it's the kind of thing no one talks about. They'll talk about the other things, but not that one. And I think from my experience as a PhD supervisor, and hi Marcel, shout out to you as well, it's one of the things that people really need to know, to discuss explicitly, because it's the kind of thing that is often left implicit but is absolutely crucial. So to help you make sense of this issue of framing the article, I'm going to, as I say, use a work of art metaphor. Obviously, I understand using the idea of a work of art in a museum is very elitist, very problematic in lots of ways. But, you know, imagine an open access, free museum with lots of feminist art. And this is also, for me, an excuse to show off the work of one of my favorite Portuguese feminist artists, and a special shout out to all the Portuguese people in the group. There are so many of you. Olá, bom dia, bom dia. So yes, so I love the work of Helena Almeida, a Portuguese artist, just recently died a couple of years ago. And those of you who know my book might recognize Helena Almeida's work as the cover of the book. And so what I want to show you now is one of Helena's works of art. I won't tell you very much about her because we don't have a lot of time, but I want to invite you to look at this and look at the role that the frame for this work of art is playing here. Because when we talk about articles, we often talk about the content of the article, you know, your data, your theories, your argument, and we don't talk about how you're framing the content of your article. And I think framing is sometimes more important, certainly than the content. It's certainly, whether it's more important or not is the debate, but it's certainly very, very, very important, the issue of how you frame your article. You need to find a frame that suits your article, like this one here, and that suits the where the work of art is placed, but that also helps the work of art stand out, right? You want a frame that fits with your content and helps that content stand out to people. And look how important it is here in this piece. If you imagine this work of art with a frame that was golden and traditional, you would interpret the painting very differently, and you might not find it so attractive, or you might find it more attractive. So you need to think very carefully, what is it about your article that you want to highlight? How can you frame the article so that it sends the right message? And how can you frame it so that it situates your article well in a broader context? So a few ideas on this. The first thing is choose the frame, right? So as you can see in this image, the frame, the wooden bit here in this case around the work of art. So things you might think about are, for example, how you set up the article. Most of us tend to say in our theses, in our books, and in many articles that I receive as an editor, people tend to frame their article something along the lines of, here is my particular study of X. And now here's my literature review and my methodology and my findings. So you start by, this is my study. But actually, there are other ways that are more effective. If you say, for example, various people are interested in Y, a big topic, right? Or a popular topic, or a topic where there's links to lots of different things. Y raises this question Z. I will answer this question Z through my particular study of X, right? The rest of the article can be the same, but what you've done is you straight away framed it much more broadly. So your article is now interesting as an answer or a contribution to a question that lots of people are interested in, and you're doing a particular study that allows you to do that, rather than you're just doing a particular study and that's it. And in a journal, that's really important, because I'm going to this is something that for me is very important. I work on Portugal. I did an ethnography of academia in Portugal. You will not believe how many people I have met over the years who have told me, it's a pity your work is about Portugal. Wouldn't it be more interesting? And I once wrote a book proposal, and I was told that if I just discarded my years of ethnography in Portugal and just did fieldwork in another country, i.e. the UK or the US, they would accept it, but not if it was about Portugal. Now, many of you will be in this situation. You're trying to publish in an international journal with an article on Turkey, on Portugal, on whatever country, right? And no one's interested in Turkey or Portugal. And people who are interested in Turkey or Portugal are not going to read an article in English about Turkey or Portugal. They're going to read an article in Portuguese about Portugal. So there's a lot of work to be done in showing how that specific context, that specific study can resonate more broadly. Unfortunately, this is more often demanded of those of us who work on not dominant countries, who peripheral, semi-peripheral countries, or who work on communities that are seen as specific, that can't be exported or extrapolated to other communities. And this has bad sides, and has meant that, you know, my work and those of many of you, your work has been diminished in some ways. But I think it also has a lot of value, because I often find that people from Anglo countries, they're not very good at identifying what's specific about their contexts, right? So they'll send an article to a journal about a TV show that is screened on the BBC, but no one else in the world has ever heard about. Or they talk about the myth of Victorian femininity, and other people don't know about Victorian femininity. So they're not very good at understanding the specificity of their context and how that might actually help them understand their own data and their own analysis. So I actually think those of us in peripheral, semi-peripheral countries have an advantage here, because we're forced all the time to explain why Turkey, why Portugal. So you have to think about it. And they say, oh, how funny that they do that in Portugal or Turkey. Why? And you go, oh yeah, why do we do that? That is weird. So I would encourage all of you who have to do it to use that as the learning experience. Don't get frustrated. It's incredibly frustrating. But also I would encourage those of you who are from Anglo countries, working on those contexts, to try to do that yourselves. Try to think, why the UK, why Australia, why America, and how is that so British or so Australian? And that will help you make sense of your own data differently. So back to the PowerPoint slide. So I've shown the first dimension of framing is how you frame, what frame you put around your own work of art. What do you say its aim is to highlight the best bits about your data and your analysis? The second aspect of framing that I think is really important is this work by Lynn Almeida will be shown alongside other works by her or by other artists. So you need to choose a frame that will blend in with the other articles in the journal, but that will also help it stand out somehow, be unique. And that's a very difficult balance. So you have to think about setting up links and dialogue with the other stuff going on in the journal and in the discipline. But also say, what can you offer? What's different? Most of us make the mistake of doing the usual gap in the literature narrative. Oh, this has been done before, but it's never been done on Turkey. Or this has been done before, but it's never been done on this specific film or magazine or whatever. Now, that's a tried and tested strategy. Many journals will accept that, that's fine, but I don't think it's a very good one for lots of reasons. First is, sometimes that has been done, but you just don't know about it, so you look ignorant, and you don't want to do that. So don't be too strong in saying something hasn't been done. So maybe it's been done in another language that you would never be able to read. And then you're very easily scooped. Very easily your article stops being valuable if you premise it just on the idea that it hasn't been done. Also, it relies too much on a feminist, or on a narrative that I don't think is very feminist, because for you to say something hasn't been done before, you end up having to simplify the work that other people have done and make it seem more narrow than it was, and make it seem less good than it was, just so you can say that yours is necessary. And there's other ways of doing that. I really like it when people, for example, send articles to our journal and set up an interesting puzzle, an interesting conundrum, something that makes me think, where I'm like, well, yeah, I'd never thought of that paradox. I'd never thought of that puzzle, or I'd never thought of that connection. And that gets people a lot more excited than there is a gap in the literature, I will fill it. If there's a gap in the literature, maybe it's because it's such a boring, unnecessary thing that no one's wanted to waste their time doing it. So how can you situate your work in relation to other people's work so that you're not flattening other people's work, you're engaging with it in a positive way, while at the same time allowing your work to stand out. Also, often people will say, oh, this hasn't been done before, and then they get as a peer reviewer someone who thinks they've done that. So already you've got an antagonistic relationship with a peer reviewer. Another thing to bear in mind is not just how your work of art connects to other works of art around you in the same journal, but how it connects to the other works of art that you're going to produce. You might publish more than one article. You might publish an article, some articles in the book. What's the relationship between them? And here, I want to go back to this idea of strategic publishing that Sophia mentioned in her comments. I've got a little diagram here for you. So this shows, I'm thinking here of someone converting a thesis chapter into an article. Many of you will have chapters that are around 10,000 words, certainly in the UK system. Maybe less, that's not important, but it might have 3 sections. You might cover 3 points or 3 case studies, for example. What a lot of people do is when they then have to transform that into a journal article, and they have to add methodology and literature review and conclusion, and also make it smaller to fit in the word count requirements, is that they try to do the same thing, A, B, and C, but just make it smaller. So straight away, you end up having a less deep analysis of A, a less deep analysis of B, and a less deep analysis of C. Sometimes this is a good idea. Let's imagine this is the only article you'll ever publish about this, or it's an article in a really good journal and you want the people in that journal to see all that you're capable of doing. Most often this is a bad strategy because you end up having a less good version of your work, and then the bits of B that you didn't use, whatever bits of B are here that you threw away, they're big enough that they're interesting, but they're small, so small that you couldn't use them in a new article, right? And if you write a book, the publisher may say, well, you've already covered A, B, and C in your articles anyway, so that chapter in the book is just going to be obsolete. A much better way to do it is to use this kind of structure. You cover A and B in the same depth, in the same complexity, and you let go of C completely. And at the end, you signal C. You say, oh, and there's this really tasty, delicious question that emerges out of A and B, but I'm so sorry, I don't have time for that today. You will need to read my next publication or my book in order to be able to access C. So straight away, you're creating an audience, links between your work, you're creating demand, you're creating appetite, and the stuff that you have out there stands on its own because the analysis of A that people are getting, sorry, I just had someone's calling me on WhatsApp. The analysis of A that you have in your article is a good analysis, it's a rich analysis. And when you, for example, send off a book proposal based on your thesis, you can say, oh, I've already published chapter 6 as a journal article, but this bit I didn't include in the article, so the book will offer an expanded version of that chapter. So straight away, you're creating a lot more of a dynamic relationship between your different publications. Okay, so I noticed at the time, people who know me will know that is my biggest problem in the world. There's never enough time. So I'll see what I can do. So next aspect of framing that I want you to think about, we've looked at the frame, the frame around the work of art. We've looked at that work of art in a room with other works of art. And now, obviously, what museum are they all in? Now, those of you who are in Portugal or have been to Portugal and to Porto might recognize this as the Fundação Serralves that held a big exhibition on Helena Almeida's work. That's the exhibition you can see in this image here. And lovely museum, lovely park as well around it. Now, what museum are you going to be in? What museum is your work of art going to be in? Is it going to be in a disciplinary journal? Is it going to be in a feminist journal, in a more positivist journal? Is it going to be in an international journal, a national journal? All of those things are going to make a difference. And Helena Almeida's work, as amazing as it may be, would not be accepted in the Portuguese Museum of Ancient Art, right? So the same article may be rejected in one place and fit very well in another place. And that isn't about the article, that is about fit. And fit is crucial. So many articles that we get in feminist theory are articles that are great, but they're not about feminist theory, right? So we'll never publish them. Not that when we publish articles that aren't just theoretical, I should say. We publish many articles that are empirical, but that they are articles that use the empirical to make a theoretical point or to make a contribution to a theoretical debate. But we get a lot of articles that don't even use feminist theory, or they're not making a point about feminist theory. So it's really important to know, where are you publishing? What do they like? Are you going to fit in there? And so, for example, I always say that if you want to get in an American journal, certain American journals, you either have to be writing about a context that they perceive to be exotic, scare quotes, and so they like it because it, you know, makes them look diverse and everything, or you have to somehow, so semi-peripheral European countries, yeah, not particularly interesting. So my article about Portugal in a US journal only got into the US journal because my article is about how the Anglo-American world is seen in Portugal. So it's kind of an article about another country, how they see the country of the journal. But, you know, things like European Journal of Women's Studies, they really love work that is looking at different European countries, maybe European comparisons. Those articles they would love, but they wouldn't get accepted in a lot of the American journals. So I'm not saying don't try by all means, but don't take it personally when you're rejected, because your work of art may have not been a good fit for that museum. And that says more about the museum and its remit than it does about your piece. So think of things like, for example, location. Is it an Anglo-American journal? Is it an European journal? Is it a US journal? Is it whatever? Think about that. That's really crucial. Think about the emphasis. Is it a more theoretical journal? Is it a more empirical journal? Is it in between the two? Think about the kind of approaches that are valued. What kind of epistemologies this journal values. More critical epistemologies, more mainstream epistemologies, what kind of methods, what kind of discipline it is. So in some journals, you might have to define gender, or you might have to define feminism. If you sent an article to Feminist Theory and you defined feminist epistemology, we would be like, what's wrong with you? Don't waste. So you have to think of it as a community, as an audience. Who are these people? What language are you going to speak to them in? And I don't mean English or Portuguese. I mean, what methodological, theoretical language? One of the things I always find so funny as an ethnographer of academia when I go to AtGender conferences is sometimes in AtGender conferences, in one room, you have someone from, for example, Portugal saying, I'm doing this really new, interesting analysis of X using Butler, and this is really new. And for that country, it might be really new. And then in another room, people are like, oh, we don't do Butler anymore, old school, now we do this other thing. You have to remember gender studies is very different things in different countries at the same time. We're in very different moments, very different theoretical debates, and it's good to know that when you submit to a journal, that you're aware of what's happening in that journal. Think about the scope of the journal. Is it a high-ranking journal? Is it a graduate journal? High-ranking journals, again, go for it, give it a go, but don't be upset if you get rejected. But more importantly, how do you find all this out? How do you know that Women's Studies International Forum likes pieces that are quite active, that have a sort of activist element, or that are on a variety of countries, that Feminist Review is more political? Like, how do you know these things? And the way that you know these things is through the wonderful means of mailing lists. I'm a big fan of mailing lists. One of the things to do is join mailing lists. You will be getting information regularly about calls for papers from journals or new issues from journals. Over time, without noticing, you will get an intuitive sense of what the journals are doing. Subscribe to content alerts for your favorite journals. Every time there's a new issue, you get an email. You have a quick look at it. It doesn't take more than 10 seconds. But if you do that at the start of your PhD or whenever, a year or two later, you already realize, oh, that journal never publishes post-structuralist stuff, or always only publishes about affect, or only publishes US stuff. It's a thing that's hard to learn if you sit down for an hour and look at all the back issues. It's easier if you're receiving table of content alerts over time. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to post on the chat for everyone just some resources, mailing lists, some of them paid, some of them free, that you can, you may want to join in order to get some of these, get call for papers. But in addition to what I'm going to post here, I would also recommend going to the website of journals that you like, that you use, and directly on their website subscribing to their alert systems. So here is a bunch of mailing lists, and I'm going to, and you can copy that and paste it somewhere else. And I'm going to have to spread that out over 2 messages because it's too long to go into 1 message. What I've put here, as you can see, it's very specific. It's the kinds of things that are relevant to me, my country, my discipline, but this is just to get you started. Obviously, I have to recommend one of my favorite mailing lists, the AtGender mailing list. It's free, so if you just go on the website, the link is on the chat, you can click there to subscribe to the mailing list, and that will give you, and a lot of the AtGender stuff is European stuff, but not a lot of UK stuff goes on there, so really good for all you British people missing Europe in post-Brexit times, but also to help you maybe get out of that British bubble, because I tell you, as a Portuguese person who has been working and living in the UK for a long time, feminist debates in the UK at the moment are such a bubble. People think it's so diverse and inclusive, but they're very specifically about British concerns. And I think it's good to also have a look at what's happening in other places and what kind of theoretical debates, empirical debates people are having. Okay, so finally, the 4th aspect of framing, let me share again. I'm sorry that it keeps going back and forth between different things. So we've talked about the frame around the work of art, the room that the work of art is in, the museum that it's in. A final thing is, okay, maybe the people who are already in the museum, who are already reading the journal, maybe they will read your article, they will stumble upon it in a table of content alerts. But what about people who aren't inside the museum yet? What are you going to do to get them in? This is a poster on a street in Porto, I imagine, for that exhibition by Helena Almeida. The title is "My Work is My Body is My Work," and she's well known for using her own body in her work in very interesting ways. Do Google her, she's got amazing stuff. So how are you going to draw people in? I'm going to stop sharing again now. Crucial things, an abstract that is clear, but that sets up the original puzzle, the interesting question, the conundrum. Don't overstate it. Don't say no one has ever studied the negotiation of X. I mean, to revolutionize everything, but also make it interesting, you know, somehow. I've talked about the title, using words that people are going to search for online. In some countries, this will be hard, certainly in French-speaking countries, Portuguese-speaking countries. There's a tendency to overcomplicate your language to sound more academic. So my first book is in Portuguese, and the title was, you know, something gender in schools. And the editors, I'm still so annoyed about this years later, pissed off about this. They changed it to schools. In English it doesn't really work, but it kind of schooling spaces. Like, schooling spaces are fucking schools, people. They're schools. But they thought it would look more academic if it was espaços escolares rather than just escolas. It's like, who in the world is going to Google schooling spaces? No one. Obviously, why do I care that I show up on Google? I don't personally, but for things like impact factors, for, you know, visibility for your institution. All of these things make a difference. So be careful how you choose the title. More importantly, this is a really, really important thing. It's a point that's difficult to explain, but I hope I'll be able to do it. I've mentioned some shifts in how you think about your work when you're writing a PhD chapter, for example, and when you're writing an article. And one of the biggest shifts that you have to make is that when you're writing, and this is something that I want to say thank you to all my PhD students, because it's talking to you that has allowed me to understand this myself, is that when you're writing your own PhD, you have a captive audience, right? You have a group of people who have been hired or invited to come and read your work, and they have to read it. Sometimes they don't, but the examiners have to read it. Whatever you've decided to write about, they have to read it, and they have to engage with you on the basis of that. But that's not how articles work. No one is forced to read your articles. No one is going to no one has time to just speculatively read your articles in neoliberal academia. So, and the people reading your article, if you're just limiting yourself to people who work exactly on the very case study or topic, that's a limited number of people. So how can you create an audience how can you create an audience for your article? By that I mean, how can you make the article something that sorry, I'm just drinking a bit of water, that will be relevant to a range of people and that will suck them in. So one of the things that I suggest is, when writing the article, don't think, if you'll allow me, I was going to use some of my own PhD students present here today as examples, but I'm not going to do that. Demet is saying no, so I'm not going to do that. Yes, you allow me, but
that's fine for me.
Okay. So let's imagine that. Okay, so I'll use your projects, but I won't. Should I say you anyway? Let's imagine that you're working on the three of you who I've noticed are here. Demet is working, her PhD was about a particular feminist magazine written during the Ottoman time. Liz Ablett, who is also in the room, I think still, was looking at how gender, putting it very simply, gender was negotiated amongst politicians working in local politics in the UK. Marcel, who is also in the room, I think, Marcel Obst, was working about anti-gender movements now in contemporary Spain. So these are all completely different topics, 3 different countries, different time periods, different theoretical frameworks. Supposedly, they would not benefit from reading each other's work in any way. And yet, all 3 of them, for example, have been thinking about, maybe because I encouraged them to, but I don't think so. I think it's because it's quite central to their objects of study. They've been thinking about how affect, for example, or how emotion works. Demet is interested in how the writers in the magazine are trying to create a certain mood, a certain emotion in their readers. Marcel is looking at how affect and mood might be created in a social movement to galvanize people, to mobilize people. So suddenly there's an angle there that Demet might work very specifically in relation to the Ottoman Empire a long time ago, but if Marcel read it, he might think, oh wait, that's really helpful for me. So how might Demet write her article in a way that highlights the links that she can make with other people? Obviously, she doesn't know Marcel is reading it or what Marcel is working on, so she can't anticipate those links. So one way to do that is, as you write your article, don't think about people working on the Ottoman Empire. Think of a PhD student in your institution or a friend who is working on a related topic. What might they enjoy about your piece? And try to generate audience. I know this is horrible, but you have to kind of sell it. You have to attract people. You have to convince them that your article is worth reading. Otherwise, they're not going to click it. So how can you write an abstract in a way that is inviting for lots of different people who might be working on different times, different countries, different disciplines, different case studies to you? Finally, when you're inviting people in and you're explaining your work to people, don't be defensive. A lot of articles are very defensive. So they're kind of justifying, you know, for example, Demet and I have had conversations about it. Sometimes Demet gets very annoyed when people say, oh, Turkey, that's not relevant. And I would get very annoyed when people said that Portugal wasn't relevant. So it's very easy to go in and say, you think Portugal isn't relevant? But I tell you that Portugal was a big empire. Portuguese is the fourth most spoken language in the world. You get very kind of like, and I think it's much better sometimes to write as if, obviously, Portugal is interesting. Obviously, Turkey is interesting. Look how interesting it is. Look, Portugal had an institutionalization of gender studies that was accelerated in ways that allows us to see things that also happen in other countries, but you don't notice for whatever reason. So Portugal helps us understand all these other countries. Wow, isn't that mind-blowing? So how can you write in a more generative way, a more positive, celebratory way, rather than quite a defensive way, when you have to justify your focus? Now, almost no time at all. So, but fortunately, the next things I have are much sort of faster and simpler, and they kind of build on things I've already said. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is writing the article. So this is how you think about the article, and then you have to write it. Obviously, you have to have an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. Make sure that the introduction is interesting and entices people in. That this can be done, for example, by starting with a story, a vignette, rather than saying, in recent years, feminists have studied this thing, but they have not yet considered this thing. Oh, I'm sleeping already, right? Something, this happened to me in a conference, or this thing happened. What does this tell us about this other thing? So a more narrative start will be very appreciated by some journals, not all, and will suck people in. Next thing they know, people will start reading it, and they'll already be in page 3, and because it's so interesting. So try to start in that way, an unusual, captivating way. Make sure the article has a strong conclusion. Don't just repeat what you've already said, because often if we're hesitating whether an article should be accepted or not, the last thing we read is the conclusion, and the conclusion is the bit where we might say, oh, actually, yes, this conclusion, this article is not good yet, but there's potential, or actually there's no potential in this article. The conclusion is often where we decide. So make sure it's strong, and that it goes back to the frame and the exciting thing about your argument. Don't just send your PhD chapter without adapting it. Make sure you adapt it. Silly things, I know, but important. Familiarize yourself with the journal's length requirements and respect them. Familiarize yourself with the formatting, the style, and respect it. Adapt your piece to the tone of the journal. I've already mentioned this. Proofread the paper and get other people to read it. It's scary, but it's better to have your first round of feedback from other PhD students as mentors, colleagues, than peer reviewers. Okay, so the article is written and framed, and now you have to submit it. Now, when you submit it, I'll come back to that in a second. Some journals still ask for you to write a letter. You know, if you're going to write a letter, don't say "Dear Sir" and it's a woman editor. Watch out for things like that. That happens to us all the time. Don't send your paper to more than one journal at the same time. People will find this out, that you've done that, and it's very bad practice. You can and you should send a book proposal to more than one place at the same time, but not an article. If you'd like to contribute to a special issue, but the deadline has passed, contact the editors anyway and ask politely if they would still be able to accept it. Don't, say that the deadline has passed and obviously they might not be able to take it, but would they be interested? Don't send the paper straight away, just send a title and an abstract. As someone who's edited special issues before, it's often the case that you get the articles and it's not quite they're not quite as good as you expected them to be. So you didn't accept them all, so suddenly you have some free space. So a late article would not only be acceptable, but would be a lifesaver. So definitely give it a go, but humbly, recognizing that you are missing the deadline. And then you submit it, and then what happens in most journals is that the editorial manager conducts the first checks, the length, the fit, the style requirements, passes it on to one of the editors who will examine it, looking at relevance, originality, quality, lots of other things. It will often go through double-blind peer review, which means that the peer reviewer doesn't know who the writer is, and the writer doesn't know who the peer reviewer is. Oh yes, Maite is sharing other mailing lists, so please do that. If you've got other mailing lists that you think people would benefit from, please share them. That's a really good idea, Maite, thank you. And then you will get a decision. This will take a long time often, but the decisions will have different wording in different journals, but usually they'll never get accepted as they are straight away in most journals. Usually you will have some level of revisions, or you might be rejected. Sometimes you might be told to revise and resubmit, or to reject and resubmit. And if people have said, do resubmit, and you're happy to do the changes, then do try to resubmit, because if people have said to do so, it's because it's possible and they're happy to consider it. If they don't want to ever see your article again, they will make it clear that they don't ever want to see your article again. So this is all going to take some time, especially now, so don't get anxious. Now, just to give you a heads up, I know the time is running out, so I'm going to move very quickly through the next bits. I'm happy to stay for longer, but I defer to Carly on the decision to do that. I know other sessions didn't run over, and I know that there are disability and other considerations around that. Obviously here it's easy because people can leave and go wherever they want, but I'm happy to continue to engage with the questions. So I don't know if you guys want to make a decision about that. Maybe you can, I don't know, Carly, you can send a message to, let's say, to Charlène and make a decision, and then you can let me know while I go over the next bits. Okay, so peer review process can feel like you're being battered violently by all sorts of people, as this cartoon shows. I would say, don't take it personally. It's very, very hard, but it's important. You should expect revisions. Revisions will come, and don't see revisions as a sign of failure. They can be heartbreaking, they can be traumatic, but see it as a dialogue, as, oh, so this annoying person wants me to do this annoying thing. Okay, I'll do it. But why are they asking this? Or maybe this theory isn't as well accepted as I thought it is. What does that tell me about the theoretical debates? Try to learn something from it. Understand how your reviewers are situated, and don't just do everything they tell you. The fact that if you do some things a reviewer asks for, you can get away with not doing all of them, as long as you justify why you've not done something. So if you do, say, 2/3 of what they said that you can do, 75%, you can get away with not doing some of it. Maybe even 50-50, depending on the journal, depending on the peer review. And don't just blindly do everything peer reviewers tell you to do, because sometimes peer reviewers contradict each other. Sometimes what the peer reviewer wants is not the same as what the editor thinks. So use your own judgment, and if you've got questions, say if there's a contradiction between different peer reviewers, or a contradiction between the peer reviewers and the editor, feel free to write an email to the editor and say, well, I've got this dilemma here, and you can ask for clarification, you can ask for help. Be very specific. Don't just say, I don't know how to do my revisions, help me, because no one is going to enjoy receiving that email. But you can say, there was this request, and I can see how that would be useful, but I also think this, what do you think? But only do this if you have a genuine dilemma. You will be expected to use your judgment to make these decisions as a scholar. So if you're struggling to make those decisions, before contacting the editor, contact a mentor or another colleague to get their advice as well. Now, one of the very last things I'm going to say, I'm just going to move through that slide, is responding to the reviewers. Now, this table here I took from one of my own revised articles. When I submitted the revised article, I sent in a document. When you send a revision, you have to explain what changes you've made. when a lot of people do it in a narrative way, just a long email explaining it, and that's very confusing for an editor to follow. It's much, and confusing for you to write and make sense of. So I would suggest creating a table like this. The first column says what reviewer made the point, reviewer 1, reviewer 2. The second column is a quote from what the reviewer said. And the third column is my response. And as you can see, I say, I have done this, I have done that, I move this. And sometimes I will explicitly say, I didn't do this for that reason, and I will justify it. You have to be, sometimes you end up being a bit passive aggressive in these tables. Like, for example, there at the top, you can see reviewer 1 says, I did not see a method section in the paper. And the paper had a fucking method section. Sorry, I'm swearing, but I was so annoyed. So I wrote, the original draft did have a section discussing methods. But as the title of that particular subsection did not refer to methods, this could be overlooked. And no doubt explains why the reviewer is saying something so stupid. So there's the kind of negotiation that you're doing, but you can negotiate. You can stand your ground if you want to. And if you don't want to make a change, don't make it. And if they don't want to take your article, take it somewhere else. Okay, so that's all I have to say about this. So the very last thing before I stop is basically pandemic. And I'm going to do this fairly quickly. I'm so sorry, Rika and others who are very interested in that. Most journals are affected, obviously, by COVID-19, especially feminist journals, where women are and people with caring responsibilities. Obviously, not all women have caring responsibilities, so let me correct myself. Where people with a whole range of caring responsibilities are overrepresented. Feminist journals are more affected than other journals, I would say. Some have stopped altogether, that's very few. Most of them are pausing their operations or slowing down their operations. So they'll have a note on their websites to say, we're still running, but you should expect it to take longer. As an editor, I've had to send peer reviewer invitations to people in the pandemic, and you feel so stupid sending people invitations to peer review articles right now. Like, who is going to want to peer review articles, use their valuable time and headspace to peer review articles? So things are taking a lot longer. But lots of journals are also using this as an opportunity to do interesting things. And I'm just going to share with you on my screen the website for one of the main feminist journals, Feminist Studies. That's their message. As you can see, they're still functioning. But they also have a call for articles and a call for commentaries on the pandemic. So if you've got something to say, these calls for commentaries can be a nice way to say something short and quickly. And various journals have these on at the moment. So it's worth having a look to see if this is something that would apply to you. I'm not going to say anything more about this now because I don't want to go all the way until the end and not have any time at all to engage with your discussions. But so I'm sorry for those of you who wanted more, but at the moment it's very hard to say what is going to happen in relation to journals. One of the things that is happening, this is very UK specific, apologies to those outside the UK, is that there is an attempt by journal editors. It's not been very well publicized, but there's an attempt by editors of many feminist journals, including Feminist Theory, to try to convince the body that manages the ref to sort of change the timelines of the ref, because they've suspended the ref, postponed the ref, but they haven't expanded the publication period. So you still supposedly have to have your articles published by the end of this year to be eligible for the ref, even if the ref happens later. So we're trying to get that to be extended, because obviously journals cannot work at the same rate now, and that's going to affect people who are trying to get publications this year. But so it's all a moving feast at the moment, and who knows what's going to happen. So I will stop there, and thank you for your patience and for your question as well. And I hope that was useful somehow. How do you want to manage this? Shall I look at the questions? Charlène, do you want to
Yes, Maria, I can look at the question, and how would you prefer it? I can read it and we just summarize the one that can be similar.
Yeah, yeah.
And so
did you make any decision about whether we can go 5 minutes or 10 minutes over?
Yes, of course. Yes, we can continue a bit. We just have to be careful for the next session,
Of course.
which is beginning at 1 London time. So yeah, we can continue a bit. We're happy with that. If everyone is okay, I think we all want to have this Q&A session with you. So yes, thanks a lot, Maria, for all this advice.
I know it's a lot of information, and you know, there's all these studies that say that no one can take in that much information, so I'm really sorry, but hopefully, because this will be recorded, you can also look back at it. And obrigada, and thank you to everyone who is saying thank you. Charlène, while you choose a question to ask, I'm just going to address one that I saw pop up and is in my mind from Luisa. Hola, Luisa. Luisa, I'd noticed there's a lot of interesting overlaps between our work, and we have the same surname. So yes, get in touch. So Luisa says, how about using the first person? Really, really good question. So this is the kind of thing where getting a sense of the museum that you're in, right? Getting a sense of the language, the style of the journal is really crucial. If you, there isn't a choice that will be applied to all feminist journals, right? If you sex roles, for example, you may remember in this table here, I'll show it back to you again, in the journal citation reports, Sex Roles and Gender and Society and Psychology of Women Quarterly, these three up here, they are American journals that are quite kind of mainstream, in mainstream disciplines. They're not so openly sort of using feminist epistemologies a lot of the time. So they would not use the first person often, right? Whereas Feminist Review, Women's Studies International Forum, others would find it very weird if you use the third person, and would in fact think that that means that you were maybe not fully aware of a lot of debates in feminist theory. So I would say, look at other articles in that journal, have a sense of what the style is, the tone. Obviously it will be very different, and utilize that when writing your own article.
Thank you, Maria. We also have the question of, could you give example of graduate feminist gender studies journal?
Yes, so one that I like, it's not specifically, I'm just putting it up, it's not specifically a gender studies one. Sorry, let me just see why it isn't working. Sorry, I know you can see my ceiling. Well, I can't get the website to work for some reason. I hope that doesn't mean the journal doesn't exist anymore, but one of my favorite graduate journals is the Graduate Journal of Social Science. The website used to be, oh, here it is. Yes, it's working. I'll share it with you now. Just give me 1 second so I can get share screen. So you're going to see it now. The Graduate Journal of Social Science. The editors and the editorial board have often been composed by feminists working in different countries. There's some really, really fantastic special issues here on feminist topics, as you can see, trans, non-monogamies, all sorts of decolonizing womanhood. Actually, as you can see, a lot of these special issues are gender and feminist. I've got a special issue that I edited here, I can show you, which is on Lost and Found in Translation. So that was about how you manage things in a feminist way when you're working across languages, you know, like doing your interviews in one language and analyzing them in another one. And I would really encourage getting involved, and that can be submitting articles, doing peer reviews for them, but also sometimes they have calls out to join the editorial team, to be an editor, to be a proofreader, to help with the social media, and it's often it's always a very lovely team of people, and everyone's been so supportive. When people have published with them, very supportive to really give you feedback that's going to be constructive. I can see other people making suggestions. There's also some suggestions, there's also a few in the US. I don't know them off the top of my head, but there's a few graduate journals, maybe, I'll have a think in a second, one I think might apply, but yeah, so that's some good ideas. Demet's inviting me also to obviously mention teaching with gender. That's run by AtGender. I'm just going to get it out for you as well. So that's going to be the AtGender website that you're going to see shortly when this goes away. And under publications, you've got the Teaching with Gender book series. And that's also a really lovely opportunity to get a publication in a book chapter that in some countries is considered less valuable for stupid reasons. But this is open access, so it's really feminist form of publishing as well, because everyone can access it and it's not stuck under a paywall, helping these kind of capital institutions make money. So lots of really interesting things, and you can download the volumes. And I think maybe someone from AtGender can help me. There is at the moment, or there was, a call for paper. Oh, here we are, the call for papers for the next one, Teaching Against Homo Nationalism. Yes. What other questions, Charlène?
So we also got the question of, so Dennis has asked,
just to say to Atlas, any suggestion for methodology journal? The GJSS takes methodology journals, and also a lot of methodology journals, like ethnography and others, have sections called research notes or something like that, that are very open to graduate papers, PhD papers being sent in. So that can be a good way of getting into a higher ranked journal. I would say, sorry, I meant to say this earlier and I didn't. I'm a believer in not publishing too soon. Obviously, many of you will be under pressure for your CVs, but I think if you're going to publish earlier, I would try to publish something that is maybe not using your data. So maybe a research note on your fieldwork dilemmas, or a discussion of the literature using your literature review. And I say this because I know from experience as a PhD supervisor and as a PhD student, sometimes our analysis of the data changes, and you can get, if you use something you've written, and then it's very easy to get stuck into a certain way of thinking about your data, and it's much harder to come out of that later. So I would save the big publications, the one about your data, your arguments, till later, after you have the full thesis and the full view of what your project is going to be.
Yes, we have the question, is it presumed that early career researchers and PhDs with no position at hand is supposed to self-finance the publishing, or are there specific journals that can publish based on merits?
Charlène, can you read that out again? I'm trying to find it and I can't find. Are you starting?
So is it presumed that early career researchers and PhDs with no position at hand is supposed to self-finance the publishing? Or the question is, are there specific journals that can publish based on merits?
So that really varies across country and across journal. When, as editors, so there's a difference often in journals between what the editor is doing and what the journal as a sort of business is doing, right? So for me as an editor, I don't care if someone's a PhD student or not. I might not even know. I'll often Google them out of curiosity and just to situate and get a sense of who to ask as peer reviewers. And so I would say try to get a page online in your institution or on academia if you're submitting papers, so that you can be Googleable by editors. But but I don't care what people are, as long as the article is interesting and has potential. But then Sage, who handles the journal, might get in touch with you and say, oh, if you want your article to be open access, you have to pay this much money. And we don't handle that side of things. You have to understand that some journals will not be open access, so that will limit the kinds of people who can access your papers. So if you're writing, for example, I know a colleague like Ruth Pierce, amazing scholar working on trans issues, she was very careful to have publications that were in good journals in order to be employable in academia, but also to have publications that were, and unfortunately good journals are often paid journals, and to have publications that were in open access journals in order for her community that she was analysing, the community of people she was trying to work with and for, they could access it, right? So we have to be quite strategic about which of your things might be closed access, paid access, and which might be open access. But it's hard to say that in general for all journals. Charlène, do you mind if I just go through, do you want to tell me what question you had thought about next? And
you can just go, you can read. There's also a question about the fact of when we come from a feminist publishing background, we could do it also for you. That referred to the very beginning, I think, when you were saying about why is it good to do that, of course.
And as I say, Sophia's point about strategic publishing, I was told as a PhD student, your thesis and your articles, each one of them doesn't have to do everything. You can, in some articles you can be an academic who speaks in complicated language and makes points about the latest developments in Deleuzean, whatever. And in another article, you can be a very, more accessible, more political. I think as feminists, we're very good often at being slightly different characters because we have to adjust to these different epistemological communities that we're in. And so I would try to make the most of that. And there are different, you can use different languages in different articles and have different audiences for different pieces. And that can be very freeing because, you're not always in the straitjacket, in the constrained position of having to fit certain journal requirements. I can see how many times is it acceptable to receive comments back from the editors? I don't know what you mean by acceptable. It'll depend. Some articles, there's 1 or 2 rounds of back and forth. You send, we ask you to revise, you revise, we ask you to revise again, it's finished. I've had articles where it was 8, 9, 10 editions, right? So it depends. It depends on how patient the editor is, depends how well you do. Please, when you're asked to revise, engage with the process properly. So revise what you want to revise, and what you don't want to revise, don't revise, but justify it, explain it. It's so annoying when you send revisions and then you get it back 3 days later and people have kind of just changed a word here and there. And it's like, oh, come on. Now I'll have to go back to you and tell you to do it properly. So do try to engage. And that doesn't mean do everything they tell you, but it means engaging, having a dialogue and showing that you've thought about the issues. I'm reading all your comments. Charlène, do you mind if I choose some questions?
Yes, of course.
I don't want to take away your role as chair.
No problem.
From Michalina 1202, do you think some contexts can make the gap in literature narrative more necessary than others? Example, when something has been silenced for political reasons. Yes, but I would still say there are more interesting ways of speaking about silencing for political reasons than saying gap in the literature. I would then say, you can still say this hasn't been researched for these political reasons, but I would still want you to say, okay, but why is it interesting to research it? What will looking at this thing, bring, what's interesting about it. And it might be that you want to say, well, to correct this political injustice, and that's a fantastic reason. But what I'm trying to say, it's not enough to say, my article is valuable because this hasn't been done, and now it's done. Yeah, but how does doing it do something in the world? Politically, methodologically, empirically, theoretically, that's not important, but what happens when you do it? It's not just filling the gap for the sake of filling the gap. The filling the gap should be the means to an other end that is a more interesting thing. And I think it's a better framing if you focus on that end rather than on the means of filling the gap. Just going back. What about using the gender neutral in English? Is it better to distinguish she, he each time, or using there? Well, this is a whole theoretical, epistemological, political debate in lots of ways. I think, again, it depends. You know, I can see a claim being made on certain topics to say, look, I actually want to use a particular pronoun to make a particular point. But if you're not making a point, I would obviously say be as inclusive as possible. And I think English is helpful in that way. Portuguese is a pain for that, as many of you know, and other languages, French. And yeah, I hope that helps. It's so great to see so many of you saying that you've enjoyed particular things, or that the things have been helpful. I'm just going to the top now, and I see there's some new messages. Okay. Louise, I don't know if you're still here, but you said, I'm not sure if I got your tip about the initial question regarding framing the article. Could you please repeat that? Can you let me know if you need anything repeated and what it was? Gail, hello, how are you? You were saying, I would really appreciate you saying more about doing it for ourselves. I'll come back to that in a second. I'm just going to see the new messages. Oh, you know, a big hug to all those of you multitasking with children. I was listening to things yesterday and making lunch at the same time for children, and listening to the ukulele by a 5-year-old who's not very good at playing the ukulele. So hats off to all those of you multitasking with caring responsibilities. Yes, so I think there aren't that many questions anymore. So yes, so I guess we're wrapping up. So if you've got any more questions, write them now. But just to say to Gail about self-publishing, I think that's a very important question. And I think, to be honest, there's a debate to be had that I'm not sure we've had enough in many countries about the feminists' relationship to publishing and to publishing academically. And I know, Gail, you're also thinking about other forms of publishing, but I think I've written about this in my own work, that a lot of people, I think, believed that somehow if they worked hard enough and got their journals indexed and recognized and valued, they could, you know, we could have our cake and eat it, as people say in English. So you could have a critical journal, a resisting journal, a political journal, but still get the credits, the points from you know, the conventional forms of academic recognition. And many of our journals have proved that is possible. You know, that you can write a very critical journal that also gives you good points on your CV. But there's a lot that we're losing in the process. I mean, the amount of labor that is involved in complying with the requirements of these businesses, labor that people are not aware of, that Gail will no doubt be aware of with her experience in self-publishing and publishing in general. And the concessions that you have to make around you know, around what you could. So, for example, one thing that people don't know, simple thing, is in some of the, I don't know too much about this, I don't know the technicalities, but in some of the metrics, some of the calculation of the quality of journals, you get more points for having higher quality if you have a low acceptance rate. So it's actually in the interest of a journal to reject people so that they have a lower acceptance rate and therefore more points on quality. And so, and you find ourselves as feminists, and often the people who are getting rejected are the people who don't have access to a talk like this, so that they're not aware of, you know, what feminist theory likes, or often they're in countries in the global south. So there's also a certain kind of like building of the quality of the journals on the back of rejecting people who are to some extent outsiders to the system. So Gail is right, fuck that, right? Do we really want to do this? And is the benefit that we're getting enough to justify this? And I think the reason it goes on is because individually there's a benefit, like all 100 of you want to get published. We need it for our jobs, for our careers, for our funders. So individually there's a benefit, even if collectively there would be more of a benefit if we all published open access in a different way. So it's one of those things that it really requires, it's hard for people individually to opt out of the system because that will affect them and their career opportunities. Maybe collectively we need to relate differently to the system. There's very scary things coming in the horizon as well. I can see people are suggesting things to read on this. There's really scary things around how these companies are going to start charging for publishing books as well. I don't know very much about it, but it's I think the dilemmas about the feminist, the compromises that feminists have to make to publish are going to get worse rather than better in the years to come. So I think conversations about this are important. And you're right, Gail, fuck the journals, fuck the metrics, not the feminists, obviously, I understood that. But there is a lot of very problematic stuff happening backstage in these journals, and you do feel a little bit like you've bargained with the devil. So yeah, and I think we have to have a debate about this.
Well, I guess we are finishing in a
the last question we have, sorry, Demet.
Yeah,
question
sure.
from Louisa that is asking if you could answer, if she could contact you, Maria, during this year.
Yes, yeah. As people know, I'm very slow at answering my emails. I'm so sorry, but I will eventually one day. Sorry, but just to say, everyone, thank you so much. I mean, we're blown away by the interest. 100 people in this room, and I suspect a lot of people tried to join and weren't able to, which says so much about the pressures to publish. But remember, I mean, it can be, if you approach it as a dialogue, it can be such a profound learning experience. And there's nothing like seeing your name in print at the end of the day, pathetic as that may be. And I would say, reach out to each other, read each other's work, make up reading groups if you can with other PhD students, with other colleagues. We do this in my department, and it's really lovely. Everyone shares their work and we can give feedback, and you learn so much through doing that. And that's a really nice collegial way of approaching publication as well. So don't do it by yourself in your little room. Well, obviously you'll have to be in your little room now that we're socially distant, but don't do it by yourself. Engage with others and make this more of a dialogue. And thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you very much, Maria. You can see from the chat box that everyone is very happy, and they appreciated your talk. Thank you very much for being here with us today, and thank you everyone who joined to this session. Don't forget the following session, which will include some ideas about COVID-19. Will start at 1 p.m. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
I'm just going to try to save the chat box before we...
Okay, I'll pause recording now.